I got a question. You mentioned this distinction between preemptive war and preventative war. As I understand, preemptive war is a situation in which the enemy has his tanks at the border, planes are in the air, the infantry is mobilized. At what point does it become a rational argument for a country to say, well, we don't see all of that happening, but it's still close enough that the international community or some doctrine or some philosophy would agree that we are right to go to war? And this came up a little bit with the 67 war between Israel and Egypt. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about that, the distinction.
Well, I mean, a lot of these issues, I mean, it's very fact-bound. You know, where are the troops? Are there any troops? I think the argument on preemption is that there has to be a genuine, serious threat of immediate attack. I mean, you have to be talking about a threat that is genuine. I mean, as opposed to trying to look into the distance. It's something where it's obvious. And I mean, I recognize the 67 war. I mean, this is one where, again, this is where you see the trying to make some of these judgments aren't easy. How much are you just trying to put pressure on another? You know, a lot of the argument on Stalin, you know, that while the Germans are massing troops, Stalin, you know, some of the argument is he thought he was going to get an ultimatum. He didn't think the Germans were crazy enough to attack. He thought Hitler was going to give him some ultimatum about, I don't know, I want more, something or other. Otherwise, I'll attack. He just, you know, I mean, it's not that he didn't know there were troops there. He thought there was something else coming, you know, as part of it. So even there, you make judgments. You know, I mean, if he'd understood what was coming, presumably he would have behaved differently militarily. I think the danger of preventive war is this: I'm going to look 10 years into the future, and I have any clue what that state will, its ability or its interests will be. And I point to, again, you know, there was serious discussion in the Johnson administration, and it was promoted by Bill Buckley at National Review magazine. His brother James was in the Senate at the time. Let us preempt the Chinese nuclear program, mid-60s. Now, should we have done so? Now, I mean, I suppose I would feel better living in a world where China didn't have nuclear weapons. But what, you know, play out if we had launched an attack in 1964, whenever this was. What would have happened? I mean, well, it's, you know, we don't know, but I think number one is China likely would, you know, it would still be kind of Maoist Red Guard. I mean, it strikes me that the end of the Cultural Revolution would not have been the end that we had, but it probably would have been so different, much more virulently nationalistic, probably still virulently communist state. That the reforms that we have today, the transformation of Chinese society, you know, raising peasants up so they now live, you know, actually, I mean, can live as opposed to, you know, utter impoverishment. A potential, I think, moderation in terms of where that, you know, country is going. All these things, I think, wouldn't have happened. And would they still have not gotten nuclear weapons? Well, who knows? What would Russia have done? Would Russia have found this as an opportunity to have rebuilt the relationship with China? I mean, I would argue that given the difficulty of looking ahead, it was probably a good judgment not to do it. Because you know, what we have found over the time is that even nasty people can be deterred. Joseph Stalin, greatest, you know, I mean, in terms of numbers, greatest mass murderer in human history. I mean, he and Mao Zedong kind of compete in raw numbers. Yeah, and we deterred him. He had nuclear weapons, didn't use them. You know, the deterrence works. Launching a war of that nature, unintended consequences, probably a bad idea. So I'd say that militates, to my mind, against preventive war, because you just do not know the future, and the unintended consequences can be so huge.
I would just add that the United States has actually not espoused the doctrine of preventive war in a formal way for any of the major uses of force over the last couple of decades. I mean, you see that on the part of policy analysis who perhaps are associated with the administration, but you don't find the United States actually making those arguments. More what they've done is what I mentioned earlier, that is that they've creatively used the resolutions adopted by the Security Council on a particular situation and said this authorizes war when in fact it's hard to find that in the text of the resolution. So, I mean, you might say, well, what they're really thinking about is preventive war, and they're coming up with another rationalization that doesn't wash in order to achieve that end, perhaps. But they haven't actually espoused it.
Just a brief question. I mean, it seems like you guys have a lot of agreement as to Congress's role into whether to declare or authorize war at the get-go. I just wonder if there's your thoughts on the War Powers Act as far as, you know, constitutionality. You know, once we are at war, how does that go too far in checking those powers, or, you know, what's your research as far as the founders believe?
Well, of course, it's criticized on both sides. I mean, advocates of congressional control argue it yields too much power to the president. Advocates of executive authority argue that it's too much of a constraint on the president. I mean, it strikes me, once a war is going, then I think it's harder for, I mean, Congress clearly can defund. But, you know, it shouldn't get involved in operations. You know, so, I mean, the question is then what kind of, you know, once you have declared war, you know, I mean, what constraints do you put on the commander-in-chief? I think that's the real, presumably Congress could decide to end it, but, you know, I mean, the war power, it's a very exact, you know, reporting to Congress, it's a number of things, some of which I think are probably okay within congressional power, some of which you could argue would be more of a question of commander-in-chief. I don't know, you know, it's probably something you've studied more.
Yeah, no, I've always viewed the War Powers Act as something of a cession of power by Congress to the president, because the Constitution says you shouldn't go to war unless there's a declaration by Congress. The War Powers Act says, well, you can go to war for 60 days, and then you've got to tell us about it, and then maybe we'll get involved.
What do you think the fact of actually asking Congress to go to wars in the sense that, regardless of whether they say yes or no, that could put us in the brink? Because the other country knows, you know, hey, they put it to the Congress, what might happen now?
Well, I guess I'd say run through recent wars and tell me in what case would it have been a problem. I mean, we had months of debate over Iraq. I mean, so the notion of going to Congress and saying we're going to have an, I mean, and among other things, Congress can have a conditional declaration of war. It's done that several times in its history. It did that in the Spanish-American War. If the Spanish don't pull the troops out, you know, you're going to go to war. You know, so, I mean, there are a number of ways Congress can do this. I just, you know, find me a conflict, you know, in recent history where you could not have done this. You know, it just strikes me that for almost every conflict, of course, I mean, Congress, you have time, Congress can make this judgment. You know, the issue of where you can't is a question of, you know, immediate defense. And that's, I think, where the founders would say, yeah, I mean, if you're attacked. But, I mean, look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt in Pearl Harbor. I mean, the Japanese attack, boom, bomb, you know, so we're trying to defend ourselves at that. Well, he goes to Congress. I mean, you know, I'm sure the military is gearing up, we've been attacked, but that doesn't prevent him from, at the same time, going to Congress and saying, okay, state of war exists, we've been attacked, I want, you know, congressional authority. And if you're looking at, you know, I mean, you know, gearing up for war over Kosovo against Serbia, on Iraq, I mean, these kinds of cases, I mean, you know, we were threatening these countries for ages. So we, you know, easily have done a conditional declaration of war, you know, unless the Serbs withdraw from Kosovo, we're going to start. I mean, I just don't see recent cases where you couldn't use it.
All right. All right, looks like we'll wrap it up. It is after 1. I want to thank everyone for coming out. Let's give one last round of applause for our speakers.